Good evening. My name is Arthur Whitmore, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this quiet, cozy corner. Tonight, we leave behind the rush of summer and set out on a slow, unhurried journey. We will listen to a story called Dandelion Wine, the autumn version. This is a tale not of bright sunlight or loud adventures, but of the golden silence of late autumn in a small town. We will follow a boy learning to capture and preserve autumn memories, the smell of smoke, the warmth of a fading day, and the cozy anticipations of winter. He will do this through a special ritual, the making of apple wine. It will be a long story, designed to accompany 10 hours of your sleep. There is no worry, no hurry, only the gentle monotony and calm of an old house, the scent of cinnamon, and the quiet, lulling whisper of time. Close your eyes, relax, and let yourself sink into this amber golden autumn where every falling leaf is a soft promise of peace. Our journey begins. A cool morning quietly tapped on the bedroom window, faintly lit by the first rays of the autumn sun. The air that slipped into the room was clean and fresh. It smelled of damp earth, fallen leaves, and a distant, almost forgotten scent of the departing summer. Douglas Spaulding stretched in his bed. He was 13 now, and the summer, bottled up in jars of dandelion wine, was behind him. The time had come when trees turned into flames of color, and their shadows grew long and translucent. He went downstairs, where his grandfather was already bustling around the old stove. Tall and lean, with eyes full of quiet wisdom, grandfather was the keeper of all family rituals. In summer, it was dandelion wine, but in autumn had its own kind of magic. On the table waited piles of freshly picked apples, golden, rosy, their polished sides shining like precious stones. Good morning, wizard, grandfather rumbled without turning from the stove. Yeah, Grandpa, Douglas mumbled, scratching his sleepy head. See these apples, Doug? They're not just fruit, they're the quiet laughter of autumn. In each one lives a cool afternoon, the rustle of a falling leaf, the first bonfires in the garden. We have to catch that laughter before it fades. His younger brother, Tom, came down next, sleepy, but with eyes glowing with anticipation. Are we making apple wine? He whispered. Grandfather nodded. Not just wine. The autumn version of our memory. Do you remember how we caught summer sunlight in the dandelions? Now we'll capture the autumn whisper. It was a new ritual. They stepped out onto the porch. The fog still lingered above the grass, but it already carried the promise of a clear day. Grandfather took out an old, time-worn basket and handed it to Douglas. Go on, Doug. Begin your day with the first step into silence. And remember, autumn knows how to speak if you know how to listen. Hear the leaves rustling under your feet. It's like the whisper of old stories. The earth tells itself. Douglas stepped onto the wet grass, and the world changed at once. It was full of sounds that summer had drowned out with its cicadas and bright sun. The soft thud of a falling acorn, the distant cry of a bird heading south, and the steady, comforting ticking of the old grandfather clock echoing from deep within the house. He felt the world slowing down around him, becoming denser and richer. It was the beginning of the autumn growing. They wandered with Tom through the backyard toward the old apple orchard. In summer, the orchard had been a lively, noisy place, full of bees and dancing shadows. Now it stood wrapped in golden silence. Leaves, like coins, drifted down with every breath of wind, and underfoot lay a crisp, russet carpet. Look, Doug, it's like someone lit 1,000 candles in the orchard, Tom whispered, pointing at the trees whose branches were still studded with the last stubborn apples. Quiet, Tom. You'll scare away the autumn whisper, Douglas replied. He knew that the apples for the autumn wine had to be special ones, not those hanging high, swollen with summer pride, but those that had already completed their fall, the ones kissed by the earth. Grandfather always said, to catch autumn, you must take what has already begun to say goodbye. They began their search. It was a slow, meditative process. They weren't just collecting, they were choosing. The perfect apple for wine was cool to the touch, with thin, almost transparent skin, and most importantly, it had to lie on the ground yet remain unbruised. Douglas bent down and picked up one, a Golden East variety. It was slightly damp with dew and smelled not only of sweetness, but also of wet clay, calm, and deep sleep. This is it. The dream of the earth, Tom. This is what we'll seal in a bottle, Douglas said, gently placing the apple into the basket. Tom found one that looked imperfect, with a small brown spot. What about this one? He asked. That's the first regret. It'll do too. Wine must remember what's been lost. Otherwise, it's just sweet juice. We need memory. They harvested for an hour and the basket grew full. The weight of the apples was pleasant, heavy, tangible. It was the weight of gathered time. Douglas sat down on an old bench beneath the largest, nearly bare apple tree. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. The scent of autumn was layered, smoke distant, faint, from the first leaf burned. The smell of farewell. Freshness, icy, pure, from the river flowing beyond the orchard. The smell of the present moment. Sweetness of overripe apples and pumpkins. The smell of promised rest. Then he heard a sound he hadn't heard all summer. The old water pump his grandfather used gave a hollow, lonely sigh. It wasn't the hum and ring of summer. It was a sound that said, quiet. All rush is behind. Now comes only waiting. Douglas opened his eyes, and everything around him was bathed in steady, gentle gold. He understood then that the autumn wine would be entirely different. If the Dandelion Wine had been a shout of joy and a bright, sun-filled day, then this, the apple wine, would be a quiet assurance that even in fading, there is a kind of beauty, a beauty that soothes and promises that everything will return. Douglas and Tom brought a basket full of apples kissed by the earth back to the kitchen. But before they could begin their magic with the juicer, Grandpa stopped them. Wait. The apples need to rest, he said, unloading the fruit onto an old linen cloth. Memory can't be hurried, Doug. It has to ripen in silence. The boys felt a flicker of disappointment. There was always waiting, but waiting was part of the ritual. To pass the time, they went to visit Colonel Freely. In summer, the Colonel was their time machine. He would sit in his old chair, puffing on his pipe, and with his phenomenal memory carry the boys away to the Wild West, to battles and gold rushes. But the autumn Colonel was different. His house, usually filled with sunlight, now seemed warm and dusky. He sat by the quietly crackling fireplace, and the air smelled of old wool and wood smoke. Colonel, we're gathering the harvest for the autumn wine, Douglas announced. Colonel Freely, who himself looked like a collector of memories, nodded. Ah, yes, apple wine. That's for the time when the past grows heavier than the future. In summer, it's easy to dream of what will be. In autumn, it's more important to know what was. He fell silent, his gaze sinking into the depths of the flame. Colonel, Tom asked softly, what era are you tuned to today? To what page of history will the autumn wind carry you? The colonel shook his head. No, Tom. Autumn isn't about the past. It's about the distance. In summer, I could show you the Battle of Gettysburg or the trek westward. Those were close. But now? He reached into his pocket and drew out some old, time faded maps. They were not maps of roads, but of winds and currents. Now I am the machine of distances, he murmured. I look at the world I've never seen and feel its cold breath. For this hour, we'll fly to the edge of the world with the migrating birds passing over the town. They carry not memories in their feathers, but promises of warmth. And the colonel began his story. He spoke of sunlit shores where the sand was hot and the waves lazy, of southern constellations never seen here above Greentown. He spoke of the thirst for the new, of how good it feels when something unexplored still lies ahead. It was astonishing. The time machine had turned into a machine of the future. He taught them that if summer memories are treasures you bottle up, then in autumn you must let them go so they can return in spring, filled with new stories. When you make your wine, Doug, said the colonel, looking at him with a long, thoughtful gaze, capture in it not the sadness of farewell, but the hope of return. Every falling leaf is a promise of a new sprout. The boys sat spellbound by his voice, breathing in the smoke of the fire and listening to stories of places that existed on no map. They listened to infinity, something you can't trap in a jar, but can always feel. Returning home after their visit to the colonel, Douglas found Grandpa busy with preparations. The apples on the linen cloth had already begun to sweat slightly, releasing their deep autumn fragrance. Now we need the spirit of the past, Doug. Without it, the wine will be flat, Grandpa said mysteriously. And just then, as if by magic, came the familiar slow creak of a wagon and a sing-song voice calling, Ragman, Mr. Jonas, anything unwanted? Anything lost? Mr. Jonas was a rag and bone man who didn't just buy and sell old things. He was a collector of forgetting. He gathered what people wanted to leave behind and kept it all in his great house, filled with the ghosts of bygone days. Grandpa called him over. Mr. Jonas, a small, silver-haired man with kind eyes, stopped his cart, which was piled high with objects like a tiny, cozy museum on wheels. Mr. Jonas, we need something autumnal for our wine. Something that holds the scent of an old attic, a quiet room, and the first chill, Grandpa requested. Mr. Jonas smiled his soft, secretive smile and began rummaging deep inside his cart. One by one, he brought out time-worn relics, a rusty little key that once opened a hope chest. That's the secret of stillness. A faded ribbon from a hat once worn to autumn balls. That's quiet joy. A perfume bottle, still faintly smelling of lavender and gentle sorrow. That's fading tenderness. Finally, he drew out a small, leather-covered chest that looked as though it had spent the last 50 years at the bottom of the ocean of time. This, said Jonas, handing it to Douglas, is the chest of forgotten years. There's nothing of value inside, just autumn things. A pressed leaf from a first date, a photograph of a house that no longer stands, a yellowed slip of paper with a poem. But most important of all, it carries that very scent of November, when the heat has just come on, the house grows warm, and outside it's damp and cold. A scent that says you're safe. Douglas lifted the lid slightly. Indeed, the smell was dense, comforting, and deep. It was the scent that wraps around you when you return home after a long walk through the autumn woods. How much? Grandpa asked. Mr. Jonas shook his head. For memory, there is no price. Just let me take one of your apples. An apple that remembers the sun and knows the feel of the earth. I'll keep that memory with me to remind myself that after autumn, there is always a new spring. They traded the little chest of old memories for an apple of the new harvest. Douglas placed the chest beside the apples. Now the ritual was complete. The earth kissed apples and the fragrance of forgotten years, all so that the apple wine would become more than just a drink. It would be a bottled assurance that everything returns and that even the quietest days are worth remembering. They began to peel the apples. The motion of the knife slicing through the skin was rhythmic and soothing. Each curling strip of peel fell away like an old, unneeded thought, freeing the juicy, pure flesh. The very heart of an autumn day, after the apples had been peeled, a gentle, almost meditative labor, the most magical part of the ritual began, the extraction of essence. Grandpa brought out an old cast iron press that had stood in the corner of the shed since his great grandfather's time. The press was heavy, solid, and smelled of machine oil, old wood, and the ghosts of 1,000 harvests. Remember, Doug, Grandpa said as he and Tom loaded the chunks of apple into the press. In summer, we made wine from light, weightless dandelions. Everything then was quick, almost like a balloon rising into the sky. But now everything is heavy and grounded. He turned the great slow wheel of the press. A deep, grating sound filled the air, like an old house sighing before winter. It was the sound of time slowing down. Douglas listened. In that sound, there was no haste, only certainty. Beneath the press, the juice began to flow. It was thick, amber, almost golden, and its fragrance was so rich that the boys closed their eyes in delight. It was the scent that combined the sweetness of summer with the cool, mossy dampness of the earth. It was the elixir of autumn. There it is, Doug, Tom whispered, watching as the juice filled the large clay vessel. Liquid silence. Yeah, and it's the kind of silence, Tom, that speaks louder than any shout. It's the sound of the earth itself preparing for sleep. The process went on for a long time. The monotonous creaking of the press, the slow, unhurried trickle of golden juice. Douglas stood transfixed, feeling his own thoughts become as slow and dense as the apple nectar itself. He thought of the colonel's words, that autumn was the machine of distance and hope. He understood now that what he was capturing in this juice wasn't summer itself, but the feeling of saying goodbye to it. A sadness that was, in truth, a gentle promise. A promise that even though everything sinks back into the earth now, it will return. When the last drop had fallen, Grandpa covered the vessel with a clean cloth. Our autumn wine is born, he said solemnly. Now it needs to breathe. It must absorb the sense of our home, the smell of wood smoke, Grandma's pies, and old books. It must become part of our memory, even before it's sealed. Douglas touched the clay vessel. It was cool to the touch. Inside, the golden secret of autumn was bubbling and breathing. He knew that someday, on a cold winter night, they would open a bottle of this wine, and along with the fragrance of apples, the room would fill with the memory of that slow, grating sound of the press, of the smell of damp leaves, and of the golden silence in the garden. And in that moment, they would understand that nothing is ever truly lost. While the apple juice began its slow, secret fermentation, Douglas and Tom set off for the hill outside town. Grandma had given them an important task to gather autumn herbs for a special seasonal tea that, as she put it, locks the door against colds and unlocks the door to good dreams. At the top of the hill, they met Miss Helen Loomis, an old and remarkable woman. She was 95, yet she moved with the ease of someone no older than 30, and her hands, lined and wise, seemed to understand the language of every blade of grass. In summer, she spoke about the brevity of time. In autumn, she spoke about endurance. Miss Loomis carried a large woven basket filled with dry stems and blossoms. "Hello, Miss Loomis. Are you gathering your stock of wisdom?" Douglas asked. She smiled. "Hello, Douglas." "Hello, Tom. I'm gathering autumn protection. When summer leaves, it doesn't take only joy with it, it leaves strength behind. The herbs that grew under the August sun and then dried in the cool September wind hold a double kind of magic." She showed them a small, modest flower. "This is the everlasting. It looks fragile, but it never loses its color, even in winter. It says, 'Everything passes, but something remains.'" Their grandmother had asked them to collect thyme and mint, but Miss Loomis taught them something new. "Look at the rowan tree," she said, pointing to the branches heavy with bright red berries. "They're bitter, aren't they? But that bitterness is the autumn truth, the truth that not everything in life is sweet, yet it's also a charm. Those berries hold strength against any frost." Douglas gathered the herbs, and each scent felt like an old, familiar melody. The smell of earth and roots was especially strong. It was a scent that pulled you downward, toward warmth, toward the hearth. It was nothing like the light, airy fragrances of summer. "And what do you gather these for, Miss Loomis?" "Medicine?" as Tom asked. "No, dear," she corrected gently. "For comfort. In winter, when it's darkest, you brew this tea. It gives you not only warmth, but also the memory of the sun you once held in your hands. It reminds you that behind all the cold and snow, a new spring is waiting." They helped her fill the basket. When Miss Loomis said goodbye, she handed Douglas a small dried bundle of wormwood. "This is the scent of memory," she whispered. "It's bitter and strong. It won't let you forget who you are. When you drink your apple wine, breathe in this scent. It will ground your memories. Don't let them drift away like smoke. Hold them tight, like these roots." Douglas pressed the herbs to his chest. They were dry and fragile, yet filled with hidden life and resilience. He carried them home, feeling no longer just a boy, but a keeper of ancient autumn secrets. When the sun finally slipped below the horizon, the Spaulding house sank into a cozy autumn darkness. It wasn't the soft, velvety night of summer, but a dense, cool kind of darkness, filled with the rustle of leaves and the scent of firewood crackling in the hearth. Douglas and Tom sat on the porch, watching as a huge orange moon rose above the trees. It looked like a giant, overripe apple, ready to fall at any moment. Grandpa came out onto the porch, carrying an old copper lantern. It hadn't been used since the previous autumn. Slowly and carefully, he wiped the glass and filled it with kerosene. "A lantern isn't just light, Doug," Grandpa said, striking a match. "It's a bottle of light. It traps a small, warm piece of the day and saves it for the night. Now, when daylight leaves us so early, we must keep it safe." When the flame caught, It cast dancing orange shadows across the porch. In that glow, the world beyond seemed vast, mysterious, and a little frightening. Listen, Tom whispered. A sound drifted through the dark, not the creak of the press, nor the whisper of leaves. It was the distant call of a train, a long, mournful whistle that carried not the promise of adventure, as it did in summer, but loneliness and distance. It was the voice of departure. Douglas knew that train was heading south. It carried summer away with it, carried the cicadas, the bright days, and all his loud summer thoughts. Where's it going, Grandpa? Douglas asked. It's going where it's still warm, Doug. It carries people away from here, but it also carries hope back, because everything that leaves always makes room for what will return. They sat in silence, bathed in the warm light of the lantern, and in that moment Douglas realized that his autumn wine would be like this lantern, a warm, sealed light they would open when the world outside turned cold and white. He reached out and touched the bottle where the juice was already fermenting. Beneath the thin cloth, he could feel a faint, living warmth. The juice was alive. It was digesting summer, turning it into autumn wisdom. That warmth was a comfort against the distant whistle of the train carrying the bright days away. Douglas knew they would seal that light and that comfort inside the glass. Grandpa gently lifted the lantern. Time for bed, my little magicians. Let the night work on your memories, and let our wine work on its essence. Douglas looked at the shadows cast by the lantern. They were long and warped, but each one ended at the doorstep. And in that, he understood. You can gaze into the darkness and listen to loneliness, but warmth always waits for you inside. The next morning, Douglas and Tom noticed that the house had grown quiet in a special way. Not like in summer, when silence meant only a brief pause before another burst of laughter and games. This was a deep, velvety silence. Grandma, who was usually bustling about from the first light of dawn, sat in her favorite rocking chair on the porch, wrapped in a wool blanket. A book rested on her lap, but she wasn't reading. It lay open as she gazed at the cooling garden. The rocking chair made a soft, rhythmic creak, a gentle sound, like the steady ticking of a great clock. Grandma, what are you doing? Tom asked, coming closer. I'm listening to the silence, dear, she replied. In summer, silence is the absence of sound. In autumn, silence is a collection of sounds. Do you hear it? The creak of the chair, the rustle of leaves, the faint tapping in the distance, they all speak of time slowing down. Douglas sat down beside her on the steps. The creak of the rocking chair did sound like the year's last song, a lullaby for the earth, for the trees, for all the memories of summer. It's like your autumn wine, Douglas. The creak is the melody of the past, Grandma said, without taking her eyes off the garden. All my life, I've been collecting melodies. The cries of gulls over the lake, your father's laughter when he was your age, and now this creak. She took Douglas's hand. Her hand was warm and dry, smelling faintly of cinnamon and old letters. When you seal your wine, Doug, don't forget this sound. It tells you about constancy. It reminds you that even when everything changes, something remains in its place, just as this chair will keep rocking as long as I sit in it. Suddenly, she smiled. I must add something of my own to your drink, so your wine isn't only about memory, but also about comfort. She stood up, and the rocking chair continued to move, creaking softly on its own momentum. Grandma returned carrying a small silver ladle. In it were a pinch of cinnamon and a few dried, wrinkled rose hips. Cinnamon is warmth you can taste. It chases the cold out of the deepest corners of winter. And rose hips, they're the stubborn beauty that clings to the branches even when everything else has given up. That's what your autumn wine needs. Douglas took the ladle. The warmth of the cinnamon tickled his nose pleasantly. He felt how this simple gesture bound their wine to the long story of their home, to its warmth and quiet endurance. It wasn't just a recipe, it was a sharing of souls. Grandma had given a part of her cozy steadfastness to their golden drink, and when winter came and they opened a bottle, they would hear not only the whisper of autumn, but also the gentle soothing creak of their grandmother's rocking chair. At last, the day of sealing arrived. The apple juice, infused with the scent of Mr. Jonas's old treasures and the cozy warmth of Grandma's cinnamon, had stopped bubbling. It had settled, becoming apple wine, amber, clear, and full of autumn wisdom. On the kitchen table stood a row of clean, shining bottles, each one waiting to become a vessel for time itself. "This is the most important moment, Doug," said Grandpa, carefully pouring the wine through a thin layer of gauze. "In summer, we caught joy on the fly and sealed its wild laughter. But autumn, we caught it slowly. And what we're sealing now isn't joy. It's a promise." He held up a bottle, already filled and corked. "This one," he said, "this is the bottle of assurance. It guarantees that even when December makes the world seem frozen forever, somewhere within, in the warmth, something new is already ripening, coming toward you." Douglas took charge of the labels. On each bottle, he was to write not just a name, but a date and a description of what they had captured that day. Tom sat beside him, holding a little pencil, solemnly dictating Bottle 1, golden silence of the garden, creak of the press, scent of damp earth, that was the present. Bottle 2, the Colonel's machine of distances, hope for the south, distant cry of a train, that was the future. Bottle 3, chest of forgotten years, smell of the kerosene lantern, warmth of home, that was the past. Bottle 4, endurance of the immortelle, comfort of cinnamon, creak of Grandma's chair, that was constancy. Each bottle became a time capsule, not of summer but of autumn, not blindingly bright but deep and thoughtful. "The Dandelion Wine was a shout of 'I'm alive,'" said Douglas, "but this wine, the apple one, it's a whisper of 'I remember.'" When the last bottle was sealed, they carried the whole row down to the cellar. It was a cool, dim place that always smelled of dampness, old wood, and patient waiting. Grandpa set the bottles on the farthest shelf. "They'll wait," he whispered. "Wait for the first true snowfall. Only then can we open them, because only against the cold and the white silence can we truly appreciate the gold and warmth we've captured in these bottles on this autumn day." Douglas looked at the line of bottles standing in the half light. They glowed with a soft, inner radiance, like small golden hearts of autumn. Now they were safe, and with them, all the quiet, comforting memories they held. The bottles of autumn wine now stood quietly in the cellar, and the house sank into a long, cozy waiting. It was that late autumn time when everything is done, everything is gathered, and all that's left is to keep warm and remember. For Douglas and Tom, these days were filled with gentle rituals. They spent long hours by the fireplace, where the crackling fire told its own ancient stories. Grandpa read aloud from old books that smelled of dust and distant summers? Listen, Doug, Grandpa would say. Winter isn't just cold. Winter is the time when you count your treasures. Every book, every bottle of wine, every warm blanket, each one is proof that you've lived through another summer and prepared yourself for the next. The evenings were rich with the scent of Grandma's apple pie, a warm, crisp sweetness that felt like a living, edible version of their autumn wine. She used the same kinds of apples, but not for fermenting, for immediate joy. Douglas often went down to the cellar just to stand beside the bottles. In the dark, they looked even more golden, like tiny pieces of captured sunlight. He knew they were waiting for snow. He waited, too, for the day when the earth would be covered with white silence. He would close his eyes and remember the creak of the old press, a sound that spoke of time moving slow and steady, the dry scent of Miss Loomis's immortelle, a promise that something remains, even when all else is gone, the distant, mournful cry of the train, which no longer sounded lonely, but like a tender, fading farewell. All of it was sealed in glass. He thought of Colonel Freely and his machine of distances. Now, with travels postponed until spring, the most important journey was inward, into himself, into the warmth of home, and each bottle was a stop along that inward road. At last, Douglas went upstairs, where the room glowed with soft light and comfort. He knew this chapter of waiting was the longest one. It could last weeks, even months. But it was necessary. The autumn wine had taught them patience, that the best things don't come quickly. They must ripen in silence and darkness. He lay down in bed. Outside, the last stubborn leaves rustled against the window. The sound was like a whisper from autumn itself, lulling the whole world to sleep, saying, "Rest, sleep. I'll keep your memories safe while you wait for spring."